All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to the fall edition of our PMCI lunchtime lecture series. I want to introduce architect and historic preservation specialist Kennedy Whiters, who is familiar to most of you in here because she has come in a couple times to our Living Lennox studio that we're looking at ideas of preservation that we heard a little bit about is quite an expansive territory that Kennedy's practice, Kilowatt, is involved in the field. So I'm going to turn it over to her to hear about this kind of multivalent practice that she is running, which deals with sort of the nuts and bolts, literally, of preservation, and also she brings a kind of critique of preservation practice, which I think is really incumbent on all of us to bring to whatever sort of dimension of the field that we find ourselves in. So with that, I'll kick it to her.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jerome, so much for the invitation, Sean as well, and Dean Gutzman. It's really nice to hear an intro of yourself because I spend quite a bit of time by myself. So thank you. Thanks a lot. So I offer a critique as well as a call to action and a request to tell fuller histories about the community I represent, and then it has ripple effects to other people across the country and the world globally as well, about how we tell the history, particularly the historical trauma, and I'll talk a little bit more defining that, about the lived experiences of people today, as well as, and most importantly, our ancestors in the past. And so I've grouped all of that together under this name called Redact the Facts. And then the longer name is Redact the Facts of Narratives and Interpretations about History or Historical Trauma to Tell a Fuller History for Racial Equity and Healing. And I will proceed in talking a little bit more about that. You can follow it on Twitter and Instagram at Redact the Facts, right there. So there are two main learning objectives in this talk that I'll share in a conversation too. Like we spoke last Friday. I believe everyone in the room was there last Friday. Yes? Or Thursday? Yeah, Thursday. Yeah, it's a conversation. Feel free to ask me questions along the way. I did time myself in practicing, and I do go over a little, but I'll try to tighten it up. But yeah, looking forward to engaging with you on what I have culled into 5 tenets of unredaction relating to grammar and language and how we talk about the projects we work on, the underlying history that relates to the buildings that we're building in neighborhoods and communities, and then identify unredacted grammar and language in historical narratives, as well as redacted grammar and language so that we can unredact it. That's the key message that I'm trying to spread across the country. I first gave this talk in a college setting at USC, University of Southern California, in February to a history communications course in their heritage conservation program. And so the instructor there asked the students to, one, read a couple of the essays I've written about this talk beforehand and then develop questions. So I've integrated some of their questions into this talk as well. And your colleagues at Pratt in Preservation saw this talk in April as well. Similar. I've adapted it as I go along. So the first question kind of leads into who I am. And I already introduced myself a little bit last Thursday, but I think you saw this slide before, so this is where I'll try to save some time. I've gone over this, how I like to introduce myself through maps. And so the first map, it covers my portfolio as well as all the travel I've done, study abroad. As Jerome mentioned, I do focus on historic preservation. So the brown icons there are the historic landmarks I have either researched in my thesis project in the southeast part of the US, the Gullah Geechee community. They are considered to be the most African of African Americans. They are descendants of enslaved Africans that were able to retain a lot of their African identity during enslavement, and hands-on preservation work in West Virginia, and then earning my first of 2 licenses to practice architecture in Seattle, working on a lot of preservation projects there, and I'm licensed here in New York. My practice, I've divided it into 3 categories of racial equity consulting. That includes these talks that I give here relating to Redact the Facts, auditing of interpretations of heritage sites. Then there's preservation consulting, that's kind of strict nuts and bolts, or masonry and wood windows and things like that. And leading preservation projects and owner's rep work, or being in-house construction manager for many projects. 3 projects that are currently in my portfolio. There's Lefferts Historic House, that's in Prospect Park. It's a partnership between the Prospect Park Alliance to manage the house, and the city owns the house. And it's not just a house, it was a house on a homestead, and unredacting the facts, it was a plantation. Unredacting the facts even further, it was a forced labor camp. The Lefferts enslaved about 25 Africans on that site, and it was a couple blocks south of where it currently is, south on Flatbush Avenue, and it's currently in Prospect Park. And so I'm leading preservation work there. There's a north wing of the house that the historians that work there, they believe that the enslaved Africans not only worked in the kitchen, we call that the north wing or the kitchen, but they also potentially lived in the attic. Of course, there's known to be auxiliary buildings on the forced labor camp site. So maybe they lived on, other buildings are no longer there, but there is potential belief that maybe they spent some time in the attic resting and also cooking in the kitchen there. Last Thursday, we talked about the preservation work, a little bit of the work that I'm doing in Chicago. It's where I'm originally from, and on the south side, in the south suburbs. This is on the south side, a community art center, African American Art Center, and it was developed in the 1940s, a rehabilitation of its original use as an 1893 single-family mansion. And so now they are going through another rehabilitation for its longevity into the next 80 years. And so I'm leading the exterior and interior preservation of that site there. And then last is Shiloh Baptist Church. It's in the north of New York City in Tarrytown, near Sleepy Hollow, and historic sites up there, Lyndhurst and Kykuit. So it's a historic Black church, and I've been working with them on doing some preservation planning there and some small renovation work there. Well, like last Thursday, this not necessarily what last Thursday's topic. I said preservation. It has its contention within it, and people have strong beliefs about it. But I believe the topic I'm talking about today even more so, because I do mention and say words like white supremacy and talk about race, and that can be a challenging topic to hear and uncomfortable. And so the goal is for us to be able to speak as comfortable as we want to and about this topic, and to support a space where everyone can be as brave as they feel comfortable being. So that's a reminder of what I would like to see, and especially what I need to see is also, I've been giving these talks since 2020, and I would say my comfort level is increasing, but there's still challenges around speaking about race. And publicly, it's a space of vulnerability for me as well. So. And then disclaimer, I mention organizations by name. It's not to shame and blame. A part of my practice, a huge part is compassion and empathy, but it's to provide examples that are currently in our society that are of redacted grammar language, and how we can tell fuller histories, and using that their example as a benchmark for how we can evolve the practice of telling stories. And then the last primer for this talk is a racial equity statement, and it's about citing Black women and citing Black people. And part of it is a reparation practice of correcting past harm and past narratives and beliefs that are still today that we as Black people do not provide positive change, positive impact in our society. And so when we do see someone doing something positive or trying to help us move forward, that we cite their work. And so I ask, cite Redact the Facts and include my name when you can, especially like my essays, things like that. And so I present this question to ground this conversation and why I do what I do, why I have felt called to bring Redact the Facts forward. And a part of it is it answers this question of what's my why. And I just ask for each of you to reflect on what's your why and why are you at City College in studying architecture and studying your specific component of architecture or planning, the science of architecture. What is your why? And that's something to reflect on either when the question comes about in your mind, or it may not even know your why. I knew my why, part of the why, and it continues to evolve. I knew my why went before I entered grad school when I applied. It's why I chose to focus in preservation and social justice when I was in grad school. But it has continued to evolve, and it evolved into Redact the Facts, which was 10 years after I finished graduate school. And for some reason, I wasn't aware of how we are telling the stories about the buildings that we're building, and that it actually matters to people outside of our practice of architecture and preservation. So my question right now is that I'm reclaiming a narrative. It's a narrative about historical trauma, about that my ancestors, that enslaved Black ancestors, enslaved African ancestors, and even after emancipation, reclaiming my own narrative as well as a descendant and someone who has experienced components of historical trauma. It's enslavement, it's redlining, it's lynching, it's discriminatory housing practices. And the last one is something that I experienced as a baby. I didn't know, my parents did. They had to sue a major real estate developer in Chicago because they discriminated against us in trying to rent an apartment right after I was born. And so that's my why, is this reclaiming this narrative. And the other component, this supports racial equity and equitable practices in how we tell narratives. And I'm finding it just through my own experience of reading unredacted interpretations about historic sites, such as signs that are outside of buildings, that I feel something that I can't really say I've felt before. And I have that example in a few slides where I just felt a sense of belonging when I read a narrative that said who did what to whom and did not hold anything back about the experience of enslaved Africans in New York City. And so when I say reclaiming the narrative, a key component of that, I arrived at this realization that this is reclaiming. This is something that's really significant. As I sat in a conference earlier this year, the second annual Northern Slavery Collective. So it's a collective of historic house museums that now people are starting to tell fuller histories at these house museums, and they were actually plantation houses or houses at forced labor camps in New York, in the Hudson Valley, and this is maybe you might know that slavery happened in New York. I didn't really know that until I moved to New York. the story I heard in Chicago is that we were, we Black people were trying, and there was only Black people. I didn't know that it was Black and Indigenous people until I moved to New York, but that we were trying to escape to freedom to the north. The reality is that there were plantations, forced labor camps along the Hudson Valley. And like an example is Dykeman Farmhouse, Lefferts, as I mentioned, Van Cortlandt House. That house is on acres and acres of land that enslaved Africans worked on. They built roads there. It's now, a gorgeous park, but it was, and they even called it the Van Cortlandt plantation, or the Yonkers plantation. And so just thinking about the history that we still don't know in this country, and even about places that we consider to be free and safe. And even you can even cross the US border. And I learned through a webinar, there was a historic group in Ontario, Canada, uncovering the history of slavery in Canada. And it was so bad up there that the freedom seekers, or Marinage, that's a word I recently learned that Africans adapted to themselves to reclaim the word of freedom, to say they are Maroons. Once they crossed the Canadian border and they saw that enslavement was even worse up there, they turned around and came back. So what is this story that we're hearing? Well, as I sat in this room, I was one of maybe 5 to 6 Black people in a room full of people who are racialized white, right? Mainly white people. And I'm thinking, I'm just sitting there. I'm just really curious about who's telling the story and who has agency in telling the story about. We're talking about slavery, and I'm one of like 6 Black people there. Who's telling the story? And if you think about the definition of a historian, or like the total ethos around them, is that they're collecting data. We mainly like historians, collecting data about and facts about the past, and then crafting a narrative and a story about what happened. And oftentimes we're telling a story, it's based on the perspective, the point of view. That's what this POV stands for, the point of view of the narrator, which means they are the agent, or they have agency of history, communication, and storytelling, if it's based on their perspective. And so I just thinking about who has agency about stories about enslavement, lynching, about redlining. And like I said, I classify all of these as historical trauma because I am approaching this this call to action, this initiative as a tool for healing. So I'm framing it as we're healing historical trauma through the way we tell stories. And this other quote I placed here to talk, to provide perspective about, again, the point of view narrator, who's been telling the stories and writing the journalism about reporting about lynching and redlining. So, there is a sense, and this a sense that white people feel like they own time and control history. And we can say this is a generalization, of course, but if we look at the statistics, just a straight statistics of the majority of historians in the U.S. are white, about 64%. And yes, there are white papers written by white people who say we should not use the passive voice, and which is a tool of redaction to tell stories about history. But it's still a pervasive presence in our language and the written word of writing about history that does not tell the fullness of the history. And so through Redact the Facts, I explore why, and also look at some of the history behind not telling fuller stories. One of this is based on white people in the South in the past wanting to control the narrative about many things. This is from a textbook from North Carolina that a group that were in support of the Confederacy, they wrote a text. They, spread this narrative and convinced textbook writers to write this narrative about slavery. And I would like someone to volunteer to read this excerpt. You can see that. Would anyone like? Yeah, please.
As a rule, the slaves were comfortably clothed, given an abundance of wholesome food, and kindly treated. Occasionally, some hard-hearted master or bad-tempered mistress made the lot of their slaves a hard one, but such cases were not common. Cruel masters and cruel mistresses were scorned then, just as men and women who treat animals cruelly are now scorned. These slaves were brought into the colonies fresh from a savage life in Africa, and in 2 or 3 generations were changed into respectable men and women. This fact shows, better than any words can, how prudently and how wisely they were managed.
Thank you. So what is this? It says a couple things in this passage. And again, it's a textbook from 1911 to 1940s. The first thing I notice is that it's saying that slavery wasn't that bad. And it's teaching kids in the South this message. And I believe that some schools, they still teach this message today. What else? There's something else that popped out of my mind that it's also saying as well. A narrative that it's painting about people. Yeah.
Saying that they were brought from savage life, which is kind of insinuating that there's this like primitive nature.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. So it's painting a narrative about Africans, Black people, that we were savages and that we needed white people to make us more respectable, and to do that through enslavement, and that it wasn't that bad. And so again, it's about who controls the narrative about people. And so I've had some of the reflection I've received from folks is that what I'm doing is pretty revolutionary. I'm a Black person telling a majority field, and particularly like preservation of white people, telling them this is how you tell my story, tell the story of Black people and our history. Because it honestly really hasn't been done. And so we have book bans right now, and we have people saying we need to teach AP African American history. And then I'm saying, okay, well, how we tell that story is also important too. So this is why I've now framed this advocacy and call to action on Redact the Facts in these 5 tenets. The first one is use the active voice, and I go into more detail in the next slides, but just a summary. No euphemisms, capitalize the W in white, identify racial identities, and include white when we talk about events. And I also call it the silent white, because sometimes it's implied. And majority of these are about moving away from obscuring information and being more direct about the facts of history, and being more inclusive, like of more information, so that the facts are facts, and not obscuring and omitting factual information. Is this okay? Not sure why that one's blurry, but yeah. So the active voice instead of the passive voice, and no euphemism. So the passive voice, is everyone familiar? I'm just going to skip over that. The passive voice and what that is. I've met many people, and it's okay. It's that are adults, and they don't understand, are not familiar with the passive voice. I learned that the passive voice is. Let me see if I can pull that up. Here we are. So I learned that the passive voice in the 7th grade was a professional way of writing. And we come across it. Has anyone else heard that in your writing, that it's more professional or academic to use the passive voice? Yeah. And so it actually omits the doer of the action in a sentence. And so when it becomes tricky and redacted grammar and language, and harmful, to be just quite honest, when talking about historical trauma, it's when we don't say who enslaved Black and Indigenous people, who lynched them, who redlined their communities, because it doesn't allow for the individuals who experienced this historical trauma to really hear the truth behind what happened to them. And where it comes into play when like doing community engagement work in community redline communities like Harlem, I think it provides it's a block to building integrity and credibility with your community if you aren't speaking honestly about the experiences that they've had in their neighborhoods. And so examples of like the passive voice versus the active voice, so like white people enslaved Black people instead of Black people were enslaved. And then no euphemisms. The word plantation, it's a euphemism. The word plantation, it connotates bucolic, palatial estates. And that doesn't paint the picture of the fullness of what happened on those spaces. There's a lot of exploitation of labor, forced labor, family separation. It was a continuation of the exploitation and erasure of culture that Europeans did with the indigenous people and nations in the U.S. And so the word plantation, it's a very comfortable word. And we know that because people get married on plantations, and they celebrate a lot of joyful celebrations there. And so another euphemism that I've come across, and these are things that I've come across in institutions that write about history on social media and their essays and blogs and newspapers, etc. Another one I came across is the wealthy elite who enslaved Black people instead of saying that the wealthy elite, that they're white. And so it's using flowery language to make something that was very, very harmful and traumatic, to not tell the fullness of it. And there's a saying in like the recovery community that a saying or the steps, like one of the steps is just accepting, accepting that a person has an addiction, or accepting, that they are experiencing something. And so the first way for us to recover from a lot of the trauma that people have experienced in this country is stating the facts and accepting that these really uncomfortable things actually happen. It's hard, but what's on the other side is probably a stronger community and strong people, more connected. The third and fourth tenets of unredaction are to capitalize the W in white. When we communicate about, say, white people, there's research that shows that lowercase letters, they connotate, in terms of race, the context of race, they connotate feelings of warmth and familiarity and safety in the reader's mind. And it speaks to how grammar and language, it's just so subtle, and it works on us on very subconscious levels that we are not aware by definition that they're actually impacting the way we interact with each other, with people, in our daily lives. And so the intent is to capitalize the W in white. I have an essay that I wrote about this that goes a little more in depth on why this is important and significant in terms of redacting the facts and pivoting away from the culture and I'll say the addiction to white supremacy. That is, it's the air we breathe. And it's just a key component of our society. And so the more we focus on something, the intention is the more that it minimizes its impact on us. And then fourth is to state enslaved Black and Indigenous people instead of enslaved peoples. And I go into this in a call to action. Oh. It's my current call to action right now about the naming of a burial ground in the Bronx. So let me. Hi, my name is Kennedy Whiters, and I'm an architect. Bronx, one of the 5 boroughs in New York City. All right, excuse me. Let me just play from here. And I'm at one of the relatively recent New York City individual historic landmarks, which was a really great celebration back in December of 2023, when the New York City Landmark Preservation Commission designated the Joseph Rodman Drake Park, and as they called it, an enslaved people's burial ground. The New York City Parks Department has named it the Joseph Rodman Drake Park and Enslaved African Burial Ground. And I'll talk a little bit about why it's called Enslaved African Burial Ground in a minute. But let's take a closer look at the cemetery by entering the park. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous breezy day here in the Bronx. What's really great about the park is that it has these wonderful trees here that serve as a buffer to what surrounds it on all 4 sides, which is in industry and truck resting points here. But I encourage you to read the designation report that talks more about the history. This site, you can see the burial, the tombstones here that are for the early European settlers in the Bronx. And they were not only settlers, but they also exploited the labor of Africans they enslaved to generate their wealth. So there's a wonderful sign here that the interpretive sign that the New York City Parks Department placed here. Of course, it could use some redaction of the facts of grammar and language. And it talks about not only the early history, but also the advocacy that, you can see here, advocacy that students from PS 48, grade school children who, through a research project, they unearthed, I love the pun on the word here in the interpretive sign, they unearthed the existence of the remains of enslaved African ancestors here, and which prompted the advocacy of the students and the support of their Bronx city council member to support in asking the New York City Parks Department to change the name of the park from the Joseph Rodman Drake Park, and to be more inclusive and include the existence of enslaved African buried here. And so they did that, which is awesome. So this is the official, the New York City Park name. And again, thankfully, the LPC of the Landmark Preservation Commission in December 2023, they designated this site as a New York City individual landmark. That's awesome. And they chose to be inclusive from their perspective by, instead of keeping it as, enslaved African burial ground, through the more research and understanding of everyone buried here, there's also the remains of indigenous people believed to be here. And so to acknowledge that this history and that the initial people here, of indigenous people here, they decided to use 2 words that are becoming more common to be inclusive in terms of the history of enslavement, and say enslaved peoples. And so the designation name in the designation report, which is in the New York City archives for this site, is the Joseph Rodman Drake Park and enslaved people's burial ground. And it's to be, from the LPC's perspective, to be inclusive of enslaved African and indigenous peoples. And from my perspective and others' perspectives, it's not inclusive. It's actually erasing the foundation and premise of enslavement in the U.S. and in particular. The premise of enslavement, in summary, was to enslave Africans and indigenous people. And it was the premise of our caste system in the U.S. And by saying enslaved peoples, it erases this history and this premise of the history of enslavement. And that's one point. Another point is that from my perspective as a descendant of enslaved Africans, it erases this connection that I have to my ancestors who Europeans, who English and Dutch and Scottish, etc., enslaved, in particular in the U.S. And so my request is for me to have for me and other, Africans, of people of African descent in the U.S., to have, and across the world, to have a connection to our ancestors, to not use the phrase enslaved peoples. And so my request of the New York City Landmark Preservation Commission is to change the designation name to the Joseph Rodman Drake Park and Enslaved African and Indigenous Peoples Burial Ground. That naming is inclusive. And 2 weeks ago, I circulated a petition as a follow-up to a letter I wrote to LPC in February. Again, the designation was in December 2023. I had a short conversation with the research department chair for the Landmark Preservation Commission about my letter. And I really appreciated that conversation, and I'm just seeking a follow-up to that conversation. And with that follow-up, I'm seeking some more support for people who also agree that the name, to be inclusive, actually, we should be saying enslaved African and indigenous peoples. So the petition is available at redactthefacts.com. You can complete the petition, and there are other ways to support Redact the Facts as well there. So thank you so much, and until next time, Kennedy Whiter signing off. Okay, so I rarely like to be in front of the camera, but I made that as a part of the petition in my current call to action, and that it goes a little more into why I'm advocating for enslaved Black and indigenous people, or enslaved Black or enslaved African instead of enslaved peoples. The last tenet is to include whites when we are speaking about or reporting about, say, activity that our society may not align with white people, which is oftentimes violent activity. And violent activity, that's one. That's the next slide that shows an example of that just happened this year. And also in speaking about suburban moms in terms of the context of polling and gaining more voters. My mother was a suburban mom. She's Black. Is that who they're talking about when they're talking about we need more suburban moms support? They are not. And so it's that, or like rural voters or things like that. There are Black people in rural areas. I worked with them. They were my clients, and I was in West Virginia. And so just to add that context, again, we're telling stories and reporting about our society. So this is an example. It's on the Redact the Facts Instagram account, where the New Yorker reported about, they said, a homegrown teen gang, and they've been doing some gang activity. They murdered, I believe, a peer in their upscale community. So I read more about what happened in this neighborhood in the article, and it was a white teen gang. in their upscale white community. And so it's alarming because, it's not the quote norm of the news that we hear about, what people don't associate teen gang. If you just saw this, people might think it's just black kids, right? A black group of kids, unless you specifically state who is doing this activity. And so it's just to allow for us to have a more inclusive narrative about violence and who's more prone. Are we more prone to do violent activity just because someone's black? And the answer is no. More definitions and grounding about this work. Just want to be mindful of time, but I view, and other people view, the experience that Black people have had in the U.S. particular as a genocide, an ongoing genocide since at least the benchmark of 1619 and the beginning of chattel slavery. And then just continue of us experience white aggression from white people, competition stirred by white people who had more power and money, and stirred more aggression amongst poor white people and Black people to keep us separate, to not unite, and be more advocating for our collective rights, and et cetera, et cetera. And so there's segregation, Jim Crow, new Jim Crow, redlining that overlapped, some great evolution in architecture of mid-century modern movement, but that actually left Black people out of that. We could not get, white folks didn't allow us to get mortgages and loose-drawn houses and things like that. So to historical trauma and what is it? Just real quick, the first sentence here, thankfully defined by a department in the United States government, the Health and Human Services Department. Says historical trauma is multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. It's a good start. However, it would be great to see some active voice, unredacted grammar and language in our government websites. One of them, the Library of Congress here, recently this year pulled this, and they're saying African Americans had been enslaved in what became the U.S. since early 17th century. It'd be good for them to say who enslaved African Americans to build the United States. 3, narrative therapy. So I view Redact the Facts as being a component of supporting narrative therapy. And some of the narrative therapy, meaning that when we tell the story about our experience, that it's actually healing, and for us, healing from traumatic experiences. And the way we tell that story, which is what Redact the Facts gets at, is that that's even more empowering for us to use grammar and language that doesn't negate the fullness of our experience, and the fullness of the people that came before us experience as well, meaning our ancestors, and healing intergenerational trauma. So it's the benefits, our feelings of shame subside, unhelpful benefits about the event are corrected, or beliefs about it. A key unhelpful belief about enslavement that we'll hear from people, that I've heard from people, is that, we've already read it, that Black people, we needed white people to treat us to be respectful. And that still beliefs today, and we talk about philanthropy as another arm of pushing that narrative. The memory becomes less triggering. You find a sense of mastery and agency about the story, and it builds confidence in an individual. And the trauma memory becomes more organized, and we begin to make sense of the trauma. And so that's just some of the benefits to how we can, about why it's important to tell stories that are fuller histories. For white supremacy culture, so I view white supremacy not as just this one individual thing, but it's a spectrum. From the lower ends, it can cause the most harm to self. The high end, it causes most harm to others. And then in the middle, there's this balanced share of harm to self and others. And so underneath the spectrum here, all the characteristics of a white supremacy culture. I'm sure there are others to include here. And I've placed in bold the elements of the culture that Redact the Facts targets. And so the first one is distance between individuals. There's research that I've come across that I've read that talks about how the passive voice, when we hear historic interpretations about the past in the passive voice, or we read it in the passive voice, it creates this psychological distance between the reader and the speaker about what the event that they're reading or listening about. So an example is reading about the Holocaust in the passive voice and saying that that happened so long ago. And then, like, why should I care about the people that Jewish people and Polish people and LGBTQIA people who German Nazis murdered during the Holocaust? Why should I care about them? Because they happened in the past. Because I'm reading it and hearing it in the passive voice. Again, this is very subconscious activity that's taking place with us purely by grammar and language. And I'm sure maybe you haven't heard about, this is new, right? And so you can take this at face value and read more about it, but there's power in words, and we hear that words matter, and they matter in so many impactful and very subtle ways in our everyday lives. Objectivity, Redact the Facts addresses that, as well as codependency. I have observed and experienced that, Black and white people in particular, we are in a codependent relationship, and it just dates all the way back to enslavement and then Reconstruction with literal slave codes that said that Black people, we had to be differential to white people in the public realm and, of course, in private as well. So an example, there were laws in place where if I, a Black person, was walking down the street and a white person was sidewalk and a white person was walking towards me, I had to step off the sidewalk to allow the white person to keep going. That's a way of placing the comfort of a white person and being deferential and acknowledging their supremacy and their hierarchy in our caste system as being superior to my body, my physical body, and my presence. And we still do that today. And we talk about, I think more people are learning what code switching is and accusing Vice President Kamala Harris of code switching and the way we speak and talk and our mannerisms and how we engage with white people, and centering and practicing another tenet or practice of white supremacy culture is the right to comfort for people in power, which in our society are white people. And especially cisgendered white men, and given the context, white women, including no accountability for people in power. This is a component and practice of white supremacy culture. And so with Redact the Facts, when we're specifically stating and including white people in particular in narratives about historical trauma and stating who did what to whom, and maybe even dwindling down to saying a Dutch family enslaved 25 Africans, it's pivoting away from centering the comfort of white people and whiteness in our society as a means of equitable practices about storytelling and healing. It's collective healing, too, because white supremacy, it impacts not just Black people. Enslavement did not just impact Black and Indigenous people. It impacted white people as well. It prevented white folks who wanted to marry a Black person from marrying someone they loved. It's made people unable to just do what is a key component of our humanity is caring and loving for other people, regardless of their skin color. And so there are these societal norms that unconsciously sometimes we buy into and we adapt in order for our self-preservation, right? And so 5, there's a culture of care. Is the opposite of white supremacy culture is a culture of care. And so this is where, again, Redact the Facts is supporting. It supports, and it's a spectrum, just like white supremacy culture. In this case, though, the goal is that everything is kind of in the middle to create for a balance of shared care for self and others in a culture of care. And on Redact the Facts in particular, it supports accountability for everyone as much as we can. Stories with nuance, narratives and interpretations of history written with unredacted grammar and language, and reciprocal care and respect. And so that question was about where did the word unredact come from, the origin story of it. At first, I started out by calling it "Tell the Full Story," and it was in response to a post that I saw on Instagram. And that's the next slide. But this one, it's about the word unredact. And I read an article in the Washington Post by a tour guide. Her name is Pat Gunn. She's a tour guide and business owner. She owns a business called Underground Tours in Savannah, Georgia. And she's a member of she's a Gullah Geechee master storyteller. And a quote from this article said that we tell people from the beginning of the stories that they tell in their tours in Savannah, that the story about slavery in Savannah has been redacted. And so the word redacted, what does that mean? To redact, that's a legal term, right? It means like to literally like erase and remove, block out text from documents. So it means to obscure or remove text, right? So to unredact, and this is not in the dictionary, I made up this word, but to unredact, it means so I redacted the word redact to make the word unredact. So to include sensitive information for publication or release broadly, to make clear, to include in a document prior to publication. So it's basically to make information clear. That's what the word unredact means. And so it all began in 2020. This is an Instagram post by the largest historic preservation nonprofit in the United States, named the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And yes, when I was a grad student like yourselves, I interned with them for 2 summers. And so I had some familiarity with the organization. And I read their post, and it said that they were describing this building that they own, and it's a building that's across the street from the White House in DC. And in the sentence above here that I'm calling out, they said this place where people were held in bondage. And for some reason, I said, wait a minute, this does not align with what they're saying in the next sentence. They're saying that they and the White House Historical Association honor this history by telling the full story of our history, by elevating and preserving the enormous and important contributions of African Americans have made to our nation. So that's great. That's a way to tell the fuller history, by honoring our contributions, because that's something that we don't hear in our history books or read in history books often, textbooks, et cetera, mandated. I learned this at home. We had our own books, but there's also something missing in this sentence here. This is in the passive voice, and it doesn't tell the full story. It doesn't tell who held people in bondage and who are the people held in bondage. It was just very, very general. And the reality is that this is a place where, generally speaking, where white people held black people in bondage. It was English holding Africans in bondage, enslaving them in bondage in an English family. There are other buildings like this in New York City on Wall Street. I learned of a building when I was in Liverpool recently. These are buildings they were warehouses where European human traffickers would warehouse Africans that they were preparing to auction on the auction blocks. And so this sentence here in the passive voice, they're saying, while this organization is saying they're telling the full story, they aren't telling the full story about this building that they own. So I decided to do something, and I launched, again, I called it Tell the Full Story, and I changed it to Redact the Facts. And it's important to note that like the key components of a full story, they're 5. And so I decided to keep going with this research. Like, what is a full story? And so a full story has 5 components. It has a plot. In the context of historical trauma, it's usually uncomfortable history of enslavement, lynching, redlining, or historical trauma. There's a setting, and the setting is a time at which this plot occurred. For example, 1619, 1865, or 1955 on Chicago's South Side, where my parents grew up, in redlined and restrictive neighborhoods. And there's characters, protagonists and antagonists, and there's a conflict. And just part of the foundation, continuing on from the experience of indigenous people, from Europeans, is the continuation of this conflict between white people and people of color in this country. And 4, as I introduced this talk, speaking about the point of view of who's telling the history in this country, and the point of view right now that we continue to have is a third person limited point of view, or a third person narrative by white people. So a white person, a white historian, standing on the outside, and then viewing the history and not inserting themselves in the narrative of the history that they're telling. And we see that with the omission of the white character or the white people in that narrative of enslavement, of lynching, of redlining, with redacted grammar and language, like the passive voice, and omitting even saying white people. And white people, I say white supremacy, but also white people. That's also considered. These are considered 2 bad words, right? So this is something to reflect on. I give honor and acknowledgement of an elder she's an ancestor, June Jordan. She's up there with Toni Morrison and Bell Hooks, but we don't hear a lot about June Jordan. June Jordan, she was an essayist. She identified as queer, and she was also an environmental designer. And I had the opportunity to talk about the work that she did with Buckminster Fuller at Docomomo. They are an organization that advocates for preservation of the mid-century modern built environment, like brutalism. I mentioned that word on Thursday, things like that. So I presented a similar talk like this at their national conference in New Haven, and they had some conference activities at Yale's campus as well. But I mentioned her work with Buckminster Fuller, and what's relevant to Redact the Facts is that she wrote this incredible essay about white supremacy culture and the passive voice in 1982. And she framed it not in the context of historical trauma, but in the context of, I'd be mindful of anyone, I've already talked about trauma, but in the context of sexual violence. And this essay has helped me understand why I hear Black people use redacted grammar and language when talking about enslavement, in particular, as well as lynching and redlining, and not saying like a white-led government was behind this erasure of Black communities. Yeah.
I just want to make sure that's done.
Like 10. Oh, yeah. I'll speed it up. Yeah. So what this helped me, and her quote was saying that the victim or the person that experiences the trauma, they accommodate to the power to power. They accommodate to the power that they felt physically by someone violating their body. And that is also the case in a culture of white supremacy, where we accommodate the people in power and positions of power in the way we tell stories that include them harming us, either individually or our families or communities or raising, et cetera. And so she touches on elements of, like I said, codependency between people and the person that experienced harm and the person in power or government in power, right to comfort and fear of conflict, open conflict. And the next slides are examples of where I've seen redacted grammar and language in place. There's an international architecture firm, planning firm called MASS, and their project description of the National Memorial for Peace and Justice that they designed, their website that talks about this, there's no mention of Black or white people in the description. However, lynching was an activity that people, and it's important to note, who's admitted to the club of whiteness, it has evolved over time, right? It was, we go date all the way back. Irish people were considered white by the white people, mainly English, and it's evolved over time of who was allowed to be white. And so it's important to note that when talking, the nuance of talking about lynching. But there is no mention of like who lynched whom in this narrative. And it's not telling, it doesn't tell the full story. This is a video that I share in this talk, but it shows how redlining was orchestrated, planned by, and initiated by white real estate agents, white bank lenders, or mortgage lenders. And of course, if you read The Color of Law, it was a total, all the way up to our federal government and highways and concrete association as well. Shocked to read that in that book. But it was a total a system at place of maintaining a system and housing system that was designed in wealth generation for white people and inheritance as well. And so when I look at an article written that the New York Times wrote in 2021 about redlining called "What is Redlining?" and I searched for the word white, and in the article that talks about history that not only impacts Black people but also white people, no mention of white people at all. However, word search, there were about 22 hits of the word Black in this article about redlining. And so, this is an excerpt from it, and it's, it says, the government's racist theory, and talking about the mainstream banks, and it was based on researcher evidence, that crafted this system, very discriminatory system that has had implications even through today and beyond. So I unredacted it and I inserted, the silent white. I added it back into this passage to tell a fuller history, and stating stronger facts. The Dyckman farmhouse, if you have visited the house or walk up there, there's a sign on their gate that the executive director at the time in 2019, she and her staff took it upon themselves to rewrite the sign. This was a sign from New York City parks. And they chose to do what I call Redact the Facts, but they did this before I developed this initiative in practice. But for me, when I read this in April, I visited the site last year in April, and I walked past it, and it was one of the first times for me, racialized as Black in the U.S., to read a sign like this and just feel of this sense of belonging, of reading a fuller history account of what my African ancestors just collectively. That's another workshop of why I can say this, my African ancestors collectively, of what their experience in the U.S., of them explicitly saying that the Dyckman family as enslavers exploited enslaved Africans to profit from their many skills which were implemented to farm the land, prepare household goods, and assist in daily domestic work. Their enforced labor enabled the Dyckman family to prosper and participate in philanthropic engagement with their neighbors. To me, that told a fuller story. So I have research study right now about grammar and language, asking people to say how they feel about grammar and language as it stands, that is redacted versus unredacted, and share how they feel. How does it make them feel to read interpretive signs that have unredacted grammar and language? this is an initiative that people across the country that support, and I appreciate that. And people are integrating the tenants into the way they write National Register nominations, and I even picked thesis projects. I had someone compliment me or say that because of this work, they chose to focus their thesis research on a site in the South. And yep, featured in a book about preservation, and I published a review of an exhibit at the American Folk Art Museum in which I noted that they did a great job. I was blown away by the exhibit, but it would be nice for them to explicitly state that the curators who did not name the African Americans or even just the Africans in many of the art exhibits over time, that they were white, and explore why. And then not just say white, but then explore why. Why did they redact that information? So thank you for your attention, and yeah.
All right, does anyone have any quick questions for Kennedy? Thoughts?
I just have a few comments really quickly, and thank you. It was like a really nice presentation. I love also the way in which you were describing the redacting also while using very known forms of us learning how to write, especially it gave me a lot of flashbacks
Oh,
to when
thank
I
you.
was learning Spanish and English in
Yep.
Puerto Rico, the ways that you should write
Mm.
correctly. But two really quick comments. One of the things that I noticed is the way that you were mentioning how the way in which a lot of the narratives that were written it was about making people comfortable, right? And that includes a way to make white people comfortable when violence is done to black people, or when to make men comfortable when violence is done to women, or cisgender and Christian people when violence is enacted to LGBTQ+, or even when people in power are to make them then comfortable too when they act enacting violence on colonized people, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So it got me just thinking about how much does making people comfortable affect the history we know, how we live it, and how we experience it,
Right.
in real time. And also, I love the fact that you were showing how a lot of articles forgot to mention these specific people, whether it's African American, women, LGBTQ people, but how it could affect research findings. And so it also got me thinking about this problem when you're writing stuff in text that it's findable, it's searchable.
That's
There's
right.
the things that you're putting on an image.
Yeah.
And so that might be harder to put. So that might be another way of also maybe on purpose or maybe not, but it's an important thing to also have in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe you're saying, oh, we should definitely put this, but you're putting it on an image, but it's harder to find.
Right. That's why it's That's right. It's an archive call to action as well. This is why I'm asking the Landmark Preservation Commission to be explicit about enslaved African and indigenous people, not say enslaved peoples. Thank you.
Anyone else before we? Yeah, Kurt.
This is maybe not a fully, I'm going to ask this sort of in draft mode. It's not fully formed object, but it seems to be like your interest is, or your approach to this is kind of like a historiographical project, like literally how you kind of write or describe a certain history. And I'm wondering if there is have you encountered or even considered a kind of radically inclusive approach to how we narrate, say, a certain site or a certain exhibition. I'm thinking about Catherine McKittrick's essay, Dear Science, in which she has these citations that take up the entire page. In one case, it's a footnote, literally a footnote, that is kind of its own mini essay and takes up a whole page. So I'm just wondering, like, do you think that there's a kind of healthy, like, limitation to the, like, or is it okay to, like, think really outside the box in terms of, like, a citational strategy or, like, the ways that we annotate history? Like, what is the role of what is the limitation, I guess, of the footnote, and, like, is that a way that you're thinking of this really at all? Like, to me, this seems like a design problem, but I'm also thinking, like, it also feels like something that, like, that historiographers are thinking about, and curators.
Yeah, it's open. I'm open to that. I haven't thought about that yet. Yeah, but I'm thinking in terms of like the fact that as like Black and colonized people, we deserve the footnote, which is nuance in our stories, and that's something that we don't get. And that's a part of the privilege of whiteness is the nuance, or just the matter of fact. And so, yeah, I thank you for that. And yeah, we deserve the footnote. And yeah.
In also in really quick in reference to the seminar, because I was at the seminar for the last two sessions. Really quick, like sometimes we as designers and architects, this is mainly for the students, but you're learning about a place. Again, like these are things that we learn about in research to apply to our work. And so I think this is also like a way to encourage you to kind of really identify what are the stories that you're reading and incorporate it into your stories. And thinking about, the kinds, even when you're out of school, when you're working on a project, and you're working with a specific client, with the kind of work that they're doing, this kind of conflict between like public and private and public interest and the kind of work that is done, who's telling that story, about the place, about how this design is going to make the place feel for who, versus the people who live there and how and they're impacted by it. What are they saying? What's out there about that? So it's important to have in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really important ongoing work that you're doing. It's not a cheery subject, but the ways that you connect it to how these things come up from a built environment lens. We're now 4 years out of 2020. 3.5 years ago, this was all we were talking about for a hot minute, right? And then, we're now in a sort of slightly different historic moment with new questions that I think relate very much to what you're talking about.
They do.
And what I like about what you're doing is I think there's materials here for built environment schools that maybe help to accompany the work the pretty rigorous, nuanced work that we have done, in terms of thinking through racial equity, justice, inclusion, but I think there's ways to work through a kind of narrative of the built environment.
Yeah.
That would be really great for schools.
Yep.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Thank you.